Brothers and sisters, in philosophy there's a concept called the slippery slope, which basically suggests that a small initial action will lead to a series of negative consequences, often without clear evidence linking the initial action to the final outcome. I'll give you a real-life example to try and explain it. You are a parent and you tell your 15-year-old son not to try cigarettes, because if he does, he will become an addict and then eventually get cancer and die young. The slippery slope concept is generally considered a fallacy because it presumes by doing the initial action, all the following possible outcomes will in fact happen with relative certainty. I suspect many of us have tried cigarettes in our youth and we didn't become an addict and die of lung cancer. But brothers and sisters, for some teenagers, smoking that first cigarette may in fact result in the actual course of events that you as a parent were trying to save your child from. Another example could be telling the same child not to steal lollies from the shop, because when they grow up they will be dishonest and will go on to steal objects of much more value and will ultimately end up in jail. We can see that while it might not eventuate in most cases, the possibility of it happening is still there. So what has all of this got to do with today's readings? Well, brothers and sisters, Jesus tells us in today's gospel, if your virtue goes no deeper than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never get into the kingdom of heaven. He tells us just hating someone is as bad as killing them. He tells us that just looking at a woman lustfully is as bad as committing adultery. Jesus knew that the scribes and Pharisees taught the law well, but he could see into their hearts, their thoughts, their intentions, and he knew that they did not put their teachings into action in their own lives. Hence he said, if your virtue goes no deeper than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never get into the kingdom of heaven. We can have all the right words, but if our thoughts and heart and actions don't match those words, we're in trouble. So what sort of virtue should we then have in our own lives to warrant heaven? Well, brothers and sisters, let's start with trying to understand exactly what the church teaches us about virtue. St. Augustine wrote that a virtue is a good habit consonant with our nature. St. Augustine says it's a habit, that is, something we do regularly, and it is in alignment with our nature, which was made good by God. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that a virtue was an operative habit essentially good, as distinguished from vice, an operative habit essentially evil. But what exactly is an operative habit? According to the philosopher Aristotle, an operative habit is a quality that enables individuals to perform righteous actions consistently. It is considered a virtue with direct application, distinguishing it from speculative habits that do not lead to action. As I was worried I may be losing you at this point, I asked artificial intelligence on my laptop to give it to us in simpler wording, and this is what I got. Virtue, as a habit, transforms moral action from sporadic choices into a durable, naturalized orientation toward the good, integrating reason, will, and human nature into a coherent moral character. So, brothers and sisters, the sort of virtue that Jesus wants of us, which will open the gates of heaven for us, is basically one that causes us to habitually do the right thing, rather than only do it from time to time. The virtue we need will require us to use our intellects to reason through scenarios and then choose the right action. Once we habitually live a virtuous life, which is what our human nature was originally designed for, then we will automatically and naturally respond to all situations with a good and right response. The important point to get from this is that virtue requires effort and training on our part. This, of course, is the consequence of original and personal sin. On the contrary, it requires no effort, only laziness, to live a life of vice. To live a virtuous life requires real and sustained effort. It is not enough, like the scribes and Pharisees, to just talk about what the right thing to do is. Our thoughts have to align with our will, and thus virtue requires us to put good thoughts and intentions into real-life actions all the days of our lives. Going back to the question of whether the philosophical concept of the slippery slope is a fallacy or not, we can all see that if we let small vices creep into our minds, hearts and lives, that these can then grow over time to become bigger vices. If a married man allows his eyes to wander without constraint, then his imagination will kick in, and the laxity of the custody of his eyes may then extend to an overactive imagination. What happens next we may then ponder. We can see that there is definitely a slippery slope sort of possibility of infidelity ahead for that man. Philosophers may claim that this is a fallacious argument, but spend some time with the men in prison and you'll soon find that their first crime was nowhere near as serious as the one that they're now in prison for. So we must strive and fight to live virtuous lives, for if our Christianity is only lip service, we'll find ourselves breaking all sorts of divine laws. We often hear people saying that the God of the Old Testament was a harsh God and the God of the New Testament is a merciful God. But if we consider Jesus' words carefully today, we'll see that to get into heaven as a Christian is in fact much harder than it would have been for the scribes and Pharisees under the old law of prohibitions.